Johnny Carson was never known for tantrums or thunderous speeches, and anyone who watched him night after night on The Tonight Show understood that his real authority lived in restraint rather than volume. Because when something offended his sense of fairness, he didn't explode. He cooled the room until everyone felt it. And that reputation was quietly confirmed on a tense evening when a featured guest was stopped backstage and treated as though his presence was conditional rather than essential, a moment that exposed the polished television era's unspoken contradictions. The show relied on the talent, charisma, and brilliance of its guests to keep America entertained. Yet behind the curtain, old prejudices still lingered. And when the guest that night, Sammy, arrived expecting to walk through the same hallway as every other performer, a security supervisor planted a hand on his chest and directed him toward a service corridor, speaking loudly enough for nearby crew members to hear, as if reminding everyone of invisible boundaries that were never written into contracts, but enforced all the same. And Sammy hesitated, exhaustion and humiliation mixing as he stared at a door that led to bright studio lights and laughter just a few steps away. When Johnny appeared from the opposite end of the hallway with a cigarette between his fingers and that familiar relaxed posture that suggested nothing urgent was happening, yet his eyes missed nothing. He stopped, said nothing, and simply looked at the man blocking his guest, letting the silence stretch until conversations died and the hum of equipment became uncomfortably loud. A quiet standoff that lasted long enough for the balance of power to visibly shift, because the guard realized he was being measured not by rank, but by consequence. And when Johnny finally spoke, it was barely above a murmur, calmly asking why someone booked on his show was being handled like an inconvenience, listening without interruption as policy was cited and responsibility was deflected upward, then reaching into his jacket and producing the folded pages of his hosting agreement, explaining in a steady tone that the show did not function without him and that he did not function without choosing who stood beside him, tearing the pages once, twice, and letting them fall to the floor as he explained exactly what would happen if the broadcast lost its host midweek and why executives would want a name attached to that decision, finishing with a quiet instruction to remove the hand and open the door, after which the guard complied immediately, stepping aside and holding the passage open as Johnny gestured for Sammy to go first, placing a hand on his shoulder and saying lightly, "Come on, Sammy. They're waiting for us," as though nothing unusual had occurred. Yet when they walked onto the studio floor together, the atmosphere shifted, conversations paused, and a subtle line had been crossed in full view of everyone present. Later, when producers nervously raised concerns about viewers or affiliates reacting poorly, Johnny responded without drama that audiences tuned in for honesty and talent, not fear, and that if his guest was unwelcome, then so was he. A position that ended the discussion instantly, and by the time the show aired that night, nothing on screen hinted at conflict, just a host and his guest exchanging humor and warmth. But behind the scenes, a message had been delivered without shouting or spectacle, proving that dignity could be defended with composure, that influence did not require intimidation, and that sometimes the most effective stand was taken by simply refusing to move. A quiet decision that reshaped the room and lingered long after the applause faded. In the days that followed, the incident was never mentioned on air, yet its impact quietly rippled through the building and beyond, because television in that era functioned on an unspoken hierarchy where everyone understood who held leverage and who was expected to comply, and Johnny's decision unsettled that structure without issuing a single press statement. Staff members who had spent years navigating back corridors began noticing doors opening more freely. Guests who once hesitated now walked with a little more ease, and executives who prided themselves on keeping things smooth realized that smoothness had often been purchased with silence rather than fairness, a realization that was uncomfortable precisely because it was accurate. Johnny returned to his desk each afternoon with the same routine, reviewing monologues, making small talk with writers, sipping coffee as if nothing had occurred. But those closest to him understood that his calm was not indifference. It was discipline, a learned refusal to let emotion dilute intention. And when colleagues tried to praise him for what he had done, he waved it off with a shrug and a joke, insisting that he had simply protected the integrity of his show. Because in his mind, The Tonight Show was not just a program. It was a promise to the audience that what they saw reflected what he believed, and that belief included the idea that talent was not conditional. Sammy, for his part, did not speak publicly about the moment either. Yet those who knew him noticed a change that was subtle but profound, a loosening of the shoulders, a willingness to occupy space without apology, as though something long withheld had finally been acknowledged. And when he returned as a guest weeks later, the greeting he received backstage was noticeably different, warmer, more respectful, not because policies had been rewritten, but because fear had been replaced with awareness, and awareness has a way of enforcing itself. Johnny understood the mechanics of power better than most, having risen from radio obscurity to become the face of late night through patience rather than force. And he knew that real authority was rarely exercised loudly. It was exercised once, decisively, and then allowed to echo. And that echo reached other studios, other hosts, other executives who quietly adjusted their own behavior, not out of moral awakening, but because precedent had been set by someone whose absence would be impossible to ignore. The Tonight Show continued as it always had, filled with laughter, interviews, and the illusion of ease. Yet beneath that polished surface, a recalibration had occurred, one that reminded everyone involved that respect was not an abstract value, but a daily practice enforced by choices. And Johnny's choice that night became one of those industry stories passed along in low voices, not embellished, not dramatized, simply repeated as a matter of fact, because facts, when left unchallenged, have a way of becoming standards. Years later, when asked in a rare moment of candor about moments he was proud of, Johnny did not cite ratings, milestones, or awards. He spoke instead about protecting the tone of his show, about making sure people felt safe walking into the room, because comedy, he believed, could only thrive where dignity was intact, and that belief guided him more than applause ever did. The audience at home never saw the stare, never heard the whisper, never noticed the torn contract on the floor, but they felt the result in the ease of conversations, the diversity of voices, the sense that the desk was a place where humanity came before hierarchy, and that may be why the show endured, not because it chased relevance, but because it quietly insisted on it. Johnny never framed himself as a hero, never claimed to be changing history. Yet history often moves through people who refuse to compromise small truths. And on that night, in a narrow hallway away from the cameras, he proved that leadership did not require a spotlight, only the courage to stand still when standing still mattered most, leaving behind not a speech or a headline, but a shift that could not be undone. In the months that followed, the atmosphere around the studio subtly shifted, and Johnny Carson's intervention became an unspoken benchmark for behavior, influencing not only staff, but guests who sensed the boundaries of respect had been redrawn without fanfare or spectacle. A reminder that authority exercised with intelligence and patience can resonate far more effectively than any loud confrontation. The writers noticed a new attentiveness in security staff. The stagehands treated performers with a quiet courtesy that had previously been inconsistent, and even visiting celebrities who had once felt constrained by backstage hierarchies moved through corridors with a confidence that seemed almost borrowed, all because one man had chosen to act with precision rather than impulsive anger, demonstrating that power and civility need not be mutually exclusive, and that enforcing respect does not always require shouting or threats, but careful observation, timing, and a refusal to normalize injustice. Johnny continued his work on The Tonight Show with his trademark ease, opening monologues, interviewing guests, and maintaining the charm and wit that had made him beloved. Yet those closest to the production understood that beneath the surface, his presence carried a protective weight, a silent standard for what was acceptable and what would no longer be tolerated. And this quiet authority shaped the culture of the show for decades, establishing a precedent for fairness and dignity, proving that true influence is often invisible, operating through the consistent exercise of principle, and that the courage to act rightly, even in a moment of private confrontation, can ripple outward, transforming environments, fostering respect, and leaving an enduring legacy that continues to inform how people behave long after the cameras stop rolling. In the end, that unseen moment mattered not for applause or praise, but because it showed how quiet resolve, exercised once, can redefine a space and remind everyone watching what dignity truly looks like.